to be talking about worshiping with our hands. Worshiping with our hands is one of the expressions of worship that we are taught throughout the Psalms. Today, I first want to look at clapping. So clapping is defined as simply clapping the hands together, and it can also mean to clang an instrument. Psalms 47:1 talks about clapping as an expression of worship with our hands and says, "Clap your hands, all peoples, shout to God with loud songs of joy." Also in Psalms 98:8 it says, "Let the rivers clap their hands and let the hills sing for joy together." Now the significance behind clapping our hands is that it shows our approval of something that God is doing or something that He's saying. Some other significant reasons for clapping in worship is that it expresses approval or appreciation. It's a sign of greeting or encouragement. It shows our joy or is a token of rejoicing. It also expresses triumph. And lastly, it's another way of pledging yourself or reaffirming the covenant that we have between God and man. Another expression of biblical worship is lifting of hands. Now, lifting of hands is something that we commonly do in our services, but it's really important to understand the meaning behind what we're doing. The Hebrew words that describe lifting of hands mean this. It's an extension of who we are in our expression of worship to God, and it carries this special significance. It means to stretch out our hands, and it means to worship or revere with raised or extended hands, and it can also mean to give thanks to God accompanied by the uplifting of hands. Now there's an interesting thing that we see in Scripture in that the Hebrew word for hand is yad, and the Hebrew word often translated to praise or giving thanks is yada. And so what we see is that the word yad is incorporated even in the word for praise or giving thanks. So what that tells us is that as we lift our hands in worship, we're actually, in lifting our hands, we're demonstrating and expressing our praise and giving thanks to God through the lifting of our hands. Another expression of worship in the Bible is with the use of instruments. So in the Bible, we have a lot of examples of instruments being used to accompany worship. In 1 Chronicles 11:11 and 1 Chronicles 12:18, we have the example of a triangle-like instrument or a three-stringed lute being used. So that could be even the modern-day equivalent of a guitar. We also have scriptures that tell us that there's a tune or a beat or a rhythm being used to accompany worship. Another Hebrew word, zamar, which means to touch or play the strings, and that has a sense of singing praise to the accompaniment of musical instruments. So again, we have this idea that God had this idea that with worship, music was supposed to be a part of that expression. Now, when it comes to the actual musicianship of playing instruments, there's actually a couple specific guiding directives that we have in Scripture. One of them is for us to play skillfully. So we can see in the Scripture that David, he set up a whole institution of worship, of Davidic worship in the temple. And it specifically says that he had trained musicians and singers. Also in the Psalms, we have Psalms that say, play skillfully before the Lord. So we see that this idea of playing skillfully, being excellent at what we do, that's for the glory of God, and that's a part of leading our congregations in worship. And one other point I want to make about instruments is that there's not a lot of specific command as far as which kind of style or even which instruments to use or not use. We see in Psalms 150, it's kind of this awesome psalm that summarizes everything that has breath, praising the Lord, and it gives multiple examples of different types of instruments. So I think it's important for us to not get hung up on which instruments are being used and what the style is like, but to identify and remember that it's the use of instruments as they accompany our worship and that heartfelt expression to the Lord that is what is pleasing to God.